when he leaned across my desk and asked, not loudly, not flirtatiously, just quiet and casual, "Do you always handle numbers this gently? Or is that just how you are with people?" I didn't answer. I didn't even blink. I just looked at him, nodded slightly like I'd heard him but wasn't sure how to respond, and that was all it took. I didn't say no, and that was the start. I still remember the way the air in the office smelled that day. Fresh coffee, toner, someone's leftover microwave lunch, nothing romantic about it. My hands were on the keyboard, my wedding ring clicking soft against the desk. Nothing in that moment screamed danger or excitement or change. But looking back now, I think it was the first time in years I felt noticed without having to ask for it. And it scared the hell out of me. I'm Tina, 53, married to Dave for going on 29 years. He drives a city bus, wears the same navy fleece jacket almost every day, the one with the frayed sleeve and the little safety pin he never remembers to fix. We have a grown daughter, Amanda, who lives upstate, and only texts when her car's acting up or when she wants to show off a new haircut. We're not a dramatic family, just ordinary, the kind of couple that has a shared calendar on the fridge and a silent agreement on who takes out the trash. And if you asked me how my life was, I'd probably say, busy, but fine. That's what women my age say when we can't quite admit how flat everything feels. I work as a bookkeeper in a mid-sized supply company, nothing fancy, mostly spreadsheets, budget reports, a few purchase orders here and there. I'm good at it. Quiet work suits me. I don't need noise or attention, or at least that's what I thought. Then Andrew showed up. He was our new regional director, the kind that wears a watch that isn't flashy but probably costs more than my car, 42, sharp haircut, button-downs with the sleeves rolled just enough to make you notice his forearms without realizing you are. He walked fast but listened slow, said thank you, like he meant it. And he didn't talk to people like they were furniture. He'd been there 3 weeks before he even spoke to me directly, but when he did, it wasn't small talk. It was something like, "You format your charts by hand?" And when I said yes, he just smiled and said, "Figures." It was strange, feeling seen over something so ordinary. But it did something. I noticed the way I sat up straighter when I heard his footsteps near my cubicle. I noticed the way he remembered how I liked my coffee and never made a big deal of it. And one afternoon, when I was scribbling some figures on a pad, he passed by, stopped, and said, "You hold your pen like an artist, not an accountant." I laughed like it was nothing, but my ears turned hot, and I had to reread the same line 3 times. The first time he asked me to join him on a site visit, I didn't know what to say. I hesitated. I told him there were others who knew the contracts better, but he waved that off. "You're the brain behind these numbers," he said. "I need you there. No one else reads vendors like you." His tone wasn't flattering. It was matter of fact, like he really did see me as valuable, not just as a pair of hands behind a screen. I said yes before I fully processed what I was agreeing to. When I told Dave that night over leftover casserole, he just shrugged and said, "Nice. Go stretch your legs, and hey, if they've got those honey-roasted peanuts at the rest stop, grab me a bag." Then he turned back to the news like nothing had changed. I know he meant well. But something about how casual he was made my chest tighten, like I'd already disappeared from the room and he hadn't noticed. The day of the trip, I wore the gray blouse I usually save for meetings, not because I wanted to impress anyone, or at least that's what I told myself, but because I needed to feel like I was still visible. The parking lot was still damp from the early rain. He was already at the car, holding the passenger door open. I smiled, thanked him, slid into the seat. And that's when it happened. He reached to close the door, and his hand brushed my shoulder. It wasn't a grab, it wasn't suggestive, just a slow, unhurried movement, like he forgot where his hand was going. I didn't move, didn't flinch, I just let it happen. And that should have been nothing. But it stayed with me the whole ride. The drive was a little over an hour. We passed through a few quiet neighborhoods, then long stretches of flat highway with those wide-open fields that always made me feel like time was standing still. He didn't talk much at first, just asked if I was comfortable with the temperature. If I wanted to pick the music, I said I was fine. The truth was, I didn't want music, I wanted silence, or rather, I needed the sound of nothing to balance out everything that had started shifting inside me. We stopped once for gas, and he bought me a coffee without asking. Exactly how I take it. 2 creams, 1 sugar. He handed it to me like he'd been doing it for years. I thanked him, tried to keep my voice neutral. It was just coffee. I told myself that at least 3 times before we pulled back onto the road. The meeting itself was routine. I took notes, asked a few questions. He did most of the talking, smooth and clear, but every so often he'd glance in my direction. Not for approval, but almost like confirmation, like I was the only other person in the room who actually understood what was being said beneath the words. And maybe I did. Afterward, we stopped for lunch at a little diner off Route 12. The kind with vinyl booths and pie displays near the register. He let me pick the booth and didn't sit across from me. Sat beside me, said the light was better on that side for reading the invoice copies. Maybe that was true, or maybe it was something else. Either way, I didn't object. Back on the road, we were quiet again. The kind of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable. It was loaded. I kept thinking about his hand on my shoulder, how it had lingered, how I'd let it. And the worst part wasn't that I liked it. The worst part was realizing how long it had been since I'd felt that kind of attention. Not affection, attention, that subtle kind that makes you feel like you're still a woman. Not just a wife, not just someone's mother, not just someone's coworker who's good with Excel. That night at the hotel, they put us in rooms directly, across the hall from each other, nothing fancy, just your average midweek corporate rate kind of place. Beige walls, plastic key cards, the smell of carpet cleaner that never really leaves. I sat on the edge of my bed, shoes off, checking my email out of habit. But really, I was stalling. I knew I wasn't tired. I knew I wasn't going to sleep. Just yet, I walked out into the hallway under the excuse of grabbing a soda from the vending machine, even though I don't even drink soda after dinner. I just needed to move. Needed a reason to pass his door. It was cracked open, a slice of yellow light against the dull carpet. He didn't say anything, just looked up from his laptop and said, "Long day." I nodded, still holding the vending machine change in my palm. "Need anything?" he asked. I should have said no. Should have stepped away. But instead I leaned on the doorframe and said, "No, just stretching my legs." He stood slowly, closed the laptop, walked toward me with that calm way he always moved, like nothing could ever surprise him. And then, without a word, he reached up and adjusted the tag of my blouse that had flipped out. Just that, a simple gesture. But his fingers brushed the back of my neck and stayed half a second too long. I didn't move. He looked at me, I looked back, and something passed between us I can't quite describe. Not lust, not exactly. More like recognition, like we both saw something in the other that had been missing in ourselves. He didn't invite me in, I didn't linger. I just said goodnight and walked back to my room, my fingers tingling, my breath shallow, my heart louder than I wanted it to be. I sat on the bed with the TV on mute and stared at the ceiling for almost an hour. Then I finally turned out the light, pulled the covers up, and let myself imagine something I knew I shouldn't. That was all it took. Not a kiss, not a touch. Just a moment. A moment I didn't say no to. I saw him before he saw me. Or maybe he just pretended not to notice, because when I stepped out of the elevator that morning, he was already sitting downstairs in the lobby cafe, one hand wrapped around a white paper cup, the other scrolling through something on his phone with the kind of easy posture that people only have when they're fully at home in their own skin. And when he finally looked up and met my eyes, he didn't stand or wave, he just smiled. That subtle kind of smile that lives more in the eyes than the mouth, and said, "Black, right? Like at the office?" And the part that stuck wasn't the coffee. It was how he remembered. I sat down without really deciding to, still adjusting my sleeve, still wondering if the blouse was too soft or if I'd just forgotten what it felt like to care how I looked before 8 a.m. And he pushed the cup toward me with that quiet confidence that comes from men who don't second-guess small gestures. And for a second, I watched the steam rise between us and thought how strange it was that two people could sit across from each other and pretend this was still about work. The meeting itself blurred by in the way things do when your brain is moving, twice as fast as your mouth, but still 5 steps behind your heart. And I remember pointing at a contract line and explaining a clause that had tripped up our billing team before. And he was listening. Actually listening. No phone in hand, no distracted nods. Just that steady gaze that made it feel like the only thing in the room that mattered was the sound of my voice. And when I leaned slightly to show a markup, on the margin, he leaned too, and our heads came close enough that I could feel his breath shift the hair near my temple. And I forgot mid-sentence what I'd meant to say. We didn't call it anything, didn't label the current between us, but it was there, low and steady, and it grew stronger in silence than it ever could have through words, like the way he didn't. Fill the quiet on the drive back. Just let it hang softly between us until he said, I don't usually trust easily, but with you, it's different. Even the silence feels easier. And I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was the first time in weeks that anything he said made me feel warm in a way that wasn't tied to guilt or duty. Later, when we took a wrong turn near the highway exit, I reached for the tablet to check directions at the same time he did, and our hands collided. Not hard, not messy, just one of those small collisions that normally ends with a quick laugh and a shrug, but his hand didn't move away immediately, and neither did mine. And when he noticed the slight tremor in my fingers, he said so quietly it almost didn't register, You're shaking. And I didn't answer. Couldn't. Because the truth sat too close to the surface and tasted too much like want. Dinner that night was the kind of ordinary that feels intimate by accident. Half-lit tables, tired servers, the hum of a kitchen you can't see but feel. And we were both running on low sleep and long hours. But I remember the way he looked at me while I stirred sugar into my tea and said, You don't realize how you look when you're focused, do you? And when I raised an eyebrow, he added, I spend half our meetings watching that look. And I didn't blush, didn't deflect. I just folded my napkin slowly and let the weight of his words settle under my ribs. It wasn't raining when we left, not yet, but the sky had that weight to it, the kind that warns you in silence. And by the time we got to the front of the hotel, it had started. Not a downpour, not a storm, just a soft, persistent drizzle that made the air smell like wet pavement and pine. And we stood under the narrow awning, too close for 2 coworkers, and just far enough apart to pretend we didn't notice, until he slipped off his jacket and held it open. For me, and when I reached to take it, his hand brushed along the base of my neck and paused. Not deliberately, not clumsily, just long enough for his fingers to find the edge of my collarbone. And when I looked at him, really looked, he was already looking at me like he was waiting for me to say something I hadn't said yet. I shouldn't, he said, his voice low and careful and just slightly unsure, and I said, but already, and that was enough. And he stepped forward, not in a rush, not dramatic, just one quiet step that shortened the distance, and then his lips were on mine. Not greedy, not forceful, just steady and deliberate and laced with something that felt like the start of a sentence we weren't ready to finish. He didn't kiss me like a man trying to make a move, not like someone chasing a fantasy or ticking off a box. It was more like he had been standing at the edge of something for too long and finally stepped forward, and I don't know what shocked me more, that he did it, or that I didn't pull away. Not even when I felt the soft pressure of his hand, just above my elbow, or the way his breath caught for a split second before he leaned in again. Just slightly, as if checking if I'd regret it halfway through. But I didn't. Not in that moment. Not even close. When it ended, and I say ended, not because there was a clear finish, but because it broke like a thread snapped under tension. I looked away first, and he stepped back like he was giving me space to breathe. And maybe that's what I needed. Or maybe I needed to stay in that pause between decision and consequence just a little longer. But the sound of a door opening behind us snapped whatever had been holding us in place, and we moved apart as though by reflex. No words, no glance back. Just two people walking in opposite directions who had shared something they weren't ready to name. Back in my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, still wearing the jacket he'd given me, still tasting rain in the corners of my lips, still wondering why my heart was moving like I'd run a mile uphill. And for the first time in years, I felt like someone had turned the dimmer switch on my life up just enough to see how low it had gotten, and I couldn't decide if what I felt was guilt or adrenaline or some strange mix of both, but it didn't sit like regret. It sat like a spark that had waited so long under dust it forgot it could burn. I took a long shower, not because I needed to wash anything away, but because the heat and the steam felt grounding. Like maybe I could come back to my body and remind myself that this didn't have to mean everything, even if it already meant something. And afterward, I sat by the window wrapped in a towel, watching the streetlights shimmer through the rain-streaked glass. And I kept replaying the way he said I shouldn't, how he said it more like a confession than a warning, and how I'd answered without thinking because it had already happened long before either of us said a word. Sleep came in pieces, like a broken film reel starting and stopping. And when morning finally dragged its gray light into the room, I didn't feel rested. I felt hollow and charged all at once, like someone had pulled a thread loose in my chest, and now every breath caught on it. And I moved slower than usual getting ready, not out of hesitation, but because I couldn't figure out what part of me I was supposed to put forward now. The employee, the wife, the woman who had kissed her boss under a hotel awning like no one else existed. He was already downstairs when I arrived. This time, sitting in the car with the engine running and his sunglasses on even though the sky was still overcast, and I slid into the passenger seat without saying anything. Just nodded once like I was greeting a version of him I didn't yet know how to face. And he nodded back. No smile this time, no clever line. Just a quiet morning that sat between us like a placeholder for everything we wouldn't say. The drive started with silence, not tense but thick, and I watched the wipers move rhythmically across the windshield and counted the seconds between exits like maybe time could smooth the edge of what had happened. But it didn't. And when he finally spoke, it wasn't about us. It was about work, about a misfiled report and some numbers we'd need to revisit. And I answered like nothing had changed, because that was easier. Because pretending it hadn't happened made the air easier to breathe. We stopped for gas somewhere halfway, and while he paid inside, I sat in the car gripping the steering wheel with both hands even though I wasn't driving. And I remember looking at my reflection in the side mirror and wondering how it was possible to look exactly the same on the outside when something inside had shifted so clearly off its axis. Like I was standing in my own life with someone else's skin pulled tight around me. Back on the road, he reached for the radio and turned it on low. Something instrumental, nothing with lyrics. And I stared straight ahead because I didn't trust myself to glance sideways, didn't trust what my face might show or what I might see on his. And the longer we drove, the more I realized we weren't going to talk about it. Not today. Maybe not ever. But that didn't make it less real. If anything, it made it more. The silence had weight now, memory now, meaning now, when we got back to the office lot and parked. We didn't sit for a minute like we sometimes did. Didn't do the usual small talk about next week's deadlines or the traffic on the highway. Just grabbed our bags and stepped out into the midday heat, and I walked ahead slightly. Not fast, but not slow either. And I knew he was watching me, even though I didn't turn. And I think that's what scared me most. That I didn't want to turn. Not because I was ashamed, but because I wasn't ready to see in his face the thing I was already starting to see in mine. They didn't ask me if I was available for the next trip, didn't offer a choice or even a moment to consider, just handed me the folder and said the meeting was moved to Thursday, so I'd need to be in Centerville by Wednesday evening and that Andrew would be leading again. And I nodded the way people do when they've already decided they won't fight it. Not because they agree, but because they've stopped arguing with their own reactions. And the strange part was that I didn't feel dread, or even nerves exactly. just this tight pulse under my ribs like something was winding back up before I could name what it was. When we pulled into the gas station on Route 89, the air was heavy with summer dust and the sharp scent of cheap fuel, and I stayed in the car watching the cracked asphalt shimmer while he went inside. Not saying anything, not offering to bring something, just disappearing through the sliding doors like any ordinary colleague on any ordinary stop, and I was still staring at the corner of the windshield where some bug had dried into a perfect crooked wing when the door opened again and he got in, handed me a cold bottle of water and a dark chocolate square like he hadn't even thought about it. Like it was muscle memory now, and placed them carefully on my lap without looking at me once. And I didn't say thank you because it didn't feel like a gift. It felt like an answer to a question I hadn't asked out loud. At the hotel, our rooms were once again side by side, numbers only 2 apart. And I don't know if that was someone's mistake or preference or just dumb coincidence. But the moment I slipped the keycard into the slot and the door blinked green, I felt the exact same flicker under my skin that I did the first time. The kind that makes your breath pause before logic can explain why, and I stepped inside slowly, like I was walking into memory instead of accommodation. Like the walls already knew what they'd heard last time, even though nothing had happened beyond silence and wondering. We didn't go out for dinner that night. Didn't bother pretending we were going to make the most of the per diem or try that seafood place the receptionist had suggested. Just mumbled something about emails and long days and ate whatever the hotel kitchen delivered to our doors, and I sat on the edge of the bed with a plastic container of chicken salad on my knees, not hungry, not full, listening to his footsteps on the other side of the wall as he moved from window to table to bed, and it struck me how loud soft sounds become when you're trying not to imagine things, and how hard it is not to imagine when every creak sounds like a thought you don't want to name. That night, I opened my notes app twice. Started a message both times, changed the words 3 times over, stared at the cursor blinking back like a dare, and ended up writing something that felt like a whisper even as I typed it. You don't pretend when you look at me, that scares me. Then sat with my thumb over the send button long enough for the screen to dim and my reflection to blur against the glass, and I didn't send it. Just let the phone drop onto the pillow beside me as I pulled the blanket halfway up my chest and stared at the ceiling fan making lazy circles that didn't cool anything down. In the office the next morning, something had shifted. Not in the obvious ways, not in conversation or tone or even expression, but in how our timing folded into each other without needing signal or eye contact. Like he'd reach for a file just as I opened the drawer to pass it, or I'd stand and move aside just as he stepped through the door. And we didn't make jokes or linger at each other's desks or slip into anything that would catch someone's attention. But everything about how we moved said something had happened, was happening, even if the air between us kept pretending nothing had changed. When he stepped into my office that afternoon, not for a meeting, just to drop off a revised printout with a note that said the contractor had emailed again, he stood a little longer. Then he needed to near the door and said in that quiet, almost neutral voice he uses when things are heavier than they sound, "If you want me to stop whatever this is, say the word, because I'm not trying to push, I see you." And the way he said it made something inside me ache, not because it was sweet or dramatic or romantic, but because it was true. And I answered without thinking, not because I wanted to escalate, but because I couldn't lie anymore. "Just don't pretend there's nothing here." And he nodded once, then turned and left without another word. Like that exchange had been both enough and too much at the same time. At lunch the next day, we ended up at the little cafe across the street, with the chipped mugs and the dusty fan that only worked on one setting. And we sat at the corner table, like always, side by side instead of across, with 2 laptops open and receipts spread between us. And while I was scrolling through budget numbers and he was reading something on his phone, his hand brushed mine. Not by accident, not boldly either, just a light touch, just fingers resting next to fingers, and I froze not because I was afraid, but because in that exact second, the sound around us dropped out like someone hit mute, and all I could hear was the silence between skin and intention. And I didn't pull away. That night, as I was folding laundry on the couch and watching the clock drift toward bedtime, Dave walked in from the kitchen with a mug of tea and leaned against the doorframe with a half smile. said in that casual, slightly teasing way he uses when he wants to sound light but is fishing for something underneath. "You've been glowing lately. That's some special new roast they've got at work? Or did one of those guys figure out how to make you laugh again?" And I smiled back, even chuckled, even played it off with a shrug. But I didn't say anything, didn't confirm or deny, and that's where the lie lived. Not in the details, but in the silence. The next morning, I left the apartment a little earlier than usual and stood in the elevator as if I didn't care who might get in. Even though I already knew by the time on the clock that it would be him, just like always, entering on the second floor, with that habit of adjusting his sleeve like there was some kind of inner rhythm to it only I could hear. And that's exactly what happened. The doors opened. He stepped in with his phone in hand, gave a small nod, said nothing, and in that silence between floors, I didn't feel awkward or nervous. I just felt present, like the elevator wasn't lifting us, but everything that had ever been suspended between us during the client meeting, I could barely register what the senior partner was saying, because every time I opened the folder to check the figures, I could feel his gaze, not direct, not burning, but as if someone had placed a palm near my shoulder, not touching, but ready to, if I leaned even half an inch. And it was that tension, subtle and constant, that kept me more focused than any cup of coffee ever could. At lunch, we ended up side by side again, like always. No planning, just coincidence, only this time I noticed he pulled out the chair before I even got there, and when I sat down, he leaned slightly and asked, like it was just about work, "Did you sleep last night?" And I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because the question was simple and the meaning wasn't, and I didn't know how to answer, because honestly, I hadn't slept. And not because of the coffee or anxiety, but because his voice still echoed in my head. "I see you." And even with my eyes closed, it felt like he was still there, somewhere inside me, just past the edge of language. By evening, I was sitting in the bedroom scrolling through reports on my tablet, though none of the numbers registered, and Dave came up behind me, placed his hand gently on my shoulder, the way he always had, and I didn't pull away or tense up, I just looked at his hand and thought how strange it was. The body doesn't lie, it either responds or it doesn't. And in that moment, I realized there was no cruel guilt, no sharp betrayal in his silence or mine. There was only what once was, and what now was, and they no longer matched. He went to bed early, like he did every weeknight, and I stayed downstairs, turned on the lamp, curled up on the couch, and even though the room was quiet, I could almost hear a phone buzzing, a message arriving, the way everything inside goes still in anticipation, but nothing came. And maybe that was fair. Because between me and Andrew, there had never been promises, only glances and touches no one saw, and words that were never spoken but remembered more vividly than, "I love you," or "I'm waiting." At work, everything kept running like clockwork. People laughed in the halls, someone brought donuts, someone else talked about their kids, and I found myself more and more like a spectator watching a play I used to star in. Only now I was in the audience, knowing the applause wasn't for me anymore, and somehow that didn't sting, didn't offend. It just was, like leaves falling. In October, something no one argues with. At some point, I realized that between me and Andrew, there wasn't a wall. There was a pause, and it wasn't empty, it was full. He didn't come close, didn't make bold moves. But when our eyes met across the meeting room or at the coffee station, I didn't see confusion or detachment, I saw restraint. Like he was waiting for me to step closer or to walk away, and he wasn't going to interfere either way. One afternoon after a meeting, he lingered at my desk, asked something about the numbers, and just before he left, he placed his hand near the edge of the folder, not on mine, not on the keyboard, just next to it. And I knew it wasn't a gesture with a reason, but with intent, because he said, without looking at me, "You still tremble when I'm near?" And I didn't answer, not because I didn't know, but because I didn't want it to become a topic we dissected, instead of a feeling we just knew. And that night, when Dave fell asleep, turned away from me, like he had for years, I lay in the dark and tried to measure how much guilt I felt, and I couldn't name a drop of it because I hadn't lied to him. I just no longer belonged entirely to him, and maybe the scariest part of all was that I hadn't even fought it. It was the third trip, and by then, no one even asked me if I wanted to go. It was just assumed that I'd handle the account side while Andrew covered the client negotiations, like always. When the calendar invite popped up, I didn't respond, with a smiley or a question mark, just clicked yes, and went back to fixing a formula that no one else ever noticed was off. By that point, I had stopped looking for signs. They were everywhere and nowhere, and the worst part was realizing that I wasn't waiting for something to happen. I was quietly preparing for it. The morning we left, the weather had already turned. Not quite fall, not quite summer anymore. The air had that dry feeling where you start carrying lotion again. He pulled up in front of my house instead of the office. Said it made more sense. With traffic, and Dave, still half distracted by his crossword, just said, "See you Sunday. Don't forget the creamer this time." I smiled and kissed him like I always did, but it felt like saying goodbye to someone in a photo. We didn't talk much on the drive out. It wasn't awkward. It wasn't silent. It just was. At some point, I turned on the radio low and he let it play. He handed me my usual drink order before I even asked. A black coffee with a single sugar. I took it without saying thanks, and he didn't seem to mind. That was the rhythm we'd fallen into. Knowing without checking, at a rest stop, he got out to grab gas and came back with a bottle of water and a chocolate bar I hadn't had in years. He didn't say a word, just tossed it gently into my lap before starting the engine. I stared at it like it was a love letter, and when I looked over at him, he was already pulling onto the road like it hadn't meant anything. Maybe it hadn't. Maybe that's what made it worse. When we checked into the hotel, our rooms were next to each other again. Of course they were. I didn't request it, didn't hint at it, didn't even notice it until the front desk clerk slid over the keys and Andrew said, "Guess we've got the left wing this time." My heart jumped before my head caught up, and I hated that I felt something over a room number. That night, we didn't have dinner together. He said he needed to catch up on emails, and I pretended to be relieved. I ordered a small salad and left most of it untouched. The wall between our rooms was thin. I could hear his footsteps, the sound of drawers opening and closing, the faint buzz of a toothbrush. I didn't turn on the TV, I just lay there and listened, not sure what I was hoping to hear. At one point, I opened a blank text message and typed, "You don't pretend when you look at me. That's the scariest part." Then I deleted it. Then I typed it again. Then I fell asleep with the phone still glowing in my hand, the message unsent. The next day was a blur of signatures, scans, and the scent of printer toner. We worked side by side through lunch, barely speaking except for updates. When we finished, he let out a long breath and leaned back in his chair. "I'm starving," he said. "Let's get something real this time." "Not a wrap and a water bottle," I said, okay without thinking, because it felt too late to say no to anything anymore. The restaurant was dark and warm and quieter than it should have been for a Friday. I didn't ask why he picked it. I didn't care. The waitress brought candles we didn't need and water with lemon, and I sat across from him feeling like I was waiting for a verdict I hadn't realized was being deliberated. He didn't flirt. He didn't touch my hand. He just watched me in that way he did, like I was halfway between a problem to solve and something already understood. Halfway through dinner, I reached to pick up my glass and he reached at the bye. Same time, our fingers brushed. He didn't pull away, neither did I. That silence right after. That was the line. Or maybe the last breath before the line. We left the restaurant without finishing our drinks. Neither of us said it, but we were both thinking about the same thing and trying not to show it. Outside, the sidewalk was wet from a short rainstorm we'd missed while eating. The air smelled metallic, like wet leaves and pavement. He didn't offer his coat this time. He didn't have to. We walked side by side, not touching, not speaking. And when we reached the hotel doors, I paused like I was waiting for something to fall from the sky and make this all easier. But nothing did. The lobby was empty, just the quiet hum of late-night lighting and the faint scent of whatever cleaner they used to keep up the illusion of freshness. The elevator opened and we stepped inside, still side by side, still silent. Our rooms were at the end of the hallway, left and right, just like before. We stood there, both holding our keycards, both pretending this was just the end of another workday. He shifted slightly, opened his door, then turned back toward me, just a fraction. "Do you want to come in for a minute?" He asked it like he was asking if I wanted to look at a draft, a spreadsheet, something neutral and safe. I didn't say yes. I just stepped forward. His room was identical to mine, but somehow felt warmer. Maybe it was the faint music playing, low from the Bluetooth speaker on the desk. Maybe it was the light from the corner lamp casting long shadows instead of the sharp hotel bulbs. He kicked off his shoes and loosened the top 2 buttons of his shirt. I sat on the edge of the bed, pretending to adjust the strap of my bag. My pulse was loud in my ears. He didn't sit next to me. He leaned against the dresser, watching me, like he was waiting for a sign but not pushing for it. "I've been trying not to think about this," I said, not even knowing what this was supposed to mean. He nodded, like he understood exactly and didn't want to make it worse by saying something smart or gentle. "Me too," he said quietly. Then we were quiet again, the kind of quiet that feels like standing in the middle of a road just before headlights appear. He walked over and sat beside me. Not too close, not touching, but close enough that I felt the warmth of him in the air between us. My shoulder tilted slightly toward his without meaning to. He noticed. "I don't want to complicate your life," he said, almost more to the room than to me. "Then don't," I answered, and my voice cracked right at the end. His hand reached out, not suddenly, not forcefully, just slowly, like he was afraid I'd move away. But I didn't. His fingers found mine where they rested on my lap. The heat of that contact made my spine straighten. We sat like that for a few seconds. Then he looked at me and said one thing. "You don't have to pretend." That was the moment, not the words, the look in his eyes when he said them. I turned my head slightly toward him and saw the way his jaw tightened, not with tension, but with restraint. I leaned forward before I even realized I was doing it. Our foreheads almost touched. I didn't kiss him. Not first, but I didn't stop him either. When his lips met mine, it wasn't hungry. It was slow, quiet, like someone pouring something they didn't want to spill. I closed my eyes and let myself forget what the rules were supposed to be. The kiss wasn't long, but it unraveled something. When we pulled back, we didn't speak. He just stood up and went to the window like he needed space, like air was thinner in the room now. I sat frozen, not ashamed, not proud, just changed. He turned toward me again, and there was no question in his eyes anymore. Just a quiet knowing, like we'd both stepped over something without planning to, and now we were standing on the other side with no way back. I didn't leave right away. He didn't ask me to. There were no dramatic gestures, no peeling off of clothes or tangled sheets. That wasn't us. Not that night. But it was still a shift, still more than what had come before, and less than what would come after. I eventually said I should go, and he nodded, walked me to the door, opened it without touching me again. "Good night," he said. I said it back. In my room, I stood in front of the mirror longer than I should have. My lipstick was faded. My hair was flat on one side. But my eyes, they looked like mine again, like I'd woken up inside my own face. I changed into pajamas, folded my clothes carefully, sat on the edge of the bed, and exhaled everything I hadn't let myself feel for months. Not joy, not guilt. Just breath, just awareness. Just the undeniable fact that something had happened, and it wasn't going away. It was a Saturday morning when the air inside our kitchen felt just a little too still, like the walls knew something I didn't. I was cleaning out the coffee pot. Same as always, watching the water swirl down the sink like it could wash away whatever tension had been building in my chest all week. When the knock came on the side door, not sharp, not rushed, just 3 deliberate taps that made me freeze with the sponge still in my hand, I opened the door without thinking. And there was Rick. My husband's old friend, the one who used to come by with beers and stories back when we still had a porch swing that didn't creak so loud. And his face wasn't mad, it wasn't smug, it wasn't anything I expected. It was just steady and tired and full of something heavier than judgment. He asked if Dave was home, and when I said no, he nodded, like that was better, like he didn't want to say what he came to say in front of both of us. Then he leaned on the railing like he always used to and said, "Look, I didn't come to stir the pot, but I know what I saw, and I know who I saw it with, and I just think he deserves to hear it from someone who ain't gonna turn it into gossip first." I didn't ask what he meant because I knew, because the way my stomach dropped told me my body had heard the truth before my mind caught up. Rick said he'd been driving Andrew for 3 months now, part-time since his retirement. Got boring, and I didn't know that all those rides to the airport or contractor sites or late project dinners meant Dave's friend was behind the wheel, hearing everything, watching everything. He didn't get specific at first, just mentioned how it started. As innocent talk, how Andrew would laugh too loud when my name came up, how sometimes we'd both take too long getting back from the hotel lobby, or how he never dropped us off separately, even though the meetings ended hours apart. He looked at me like he wanted me to interrupt, to deny, to even get mad. But I didn't. I couldn't. I just stood there with coffee water still dripping from the counter and nodded once like that made it real. He said he didn't want to hurt Dave, but keeping it to himself felt worse. And I think I believed him. Not because he sounded noble, but because he looked worn out like a man who hadn't slept since figuring out the truth. Dave didn't come home that evening until close to midnight. No calls, no texts, no keys rattling, just the sound of the screen door groaning open and his steps slow across the kitchen linoleum. I sat at the table, not pretending to sleep, not pretending anything. He didn't look at me when he passed, didn't ask questions or raise his voice. Just walked down the hall with that same work bag he's carried for years like it held more than tools now. I waited until I heard the bedroom door click before I finally exhaled. And even then, it didn't feel like breathing. It felt like collapse, right? Morning. His suitcase was by the door and his side of the bathroom was empty. And when I asked if he'd had breakfast, he said, "I'm not angry at you, not like you think. I'm just not the man who waits for someone who doesn't look back." Then he kissed me once on the top of my head, like I was already gone, and left before I could figure out how to answer. I didn't chase him. I didn't call. I just stood there barefoot in a kitchen that smelled like old toast and the beginning of something I never asked for. The office felt colder than usual the next day. And not because of the air conditioning. People didn't look at me the same, not even the ones who liked me before. Carol from reception smiled like nothing was wrong, but her eyes darted too fast. The young guy in accounting asked if I was okay with this week's budget adjustments, but his tone was weirdly gentle, like I was breakable now. And then came the email. Subject line, "Please see me, HR." No exclamation point, no details, just quiet doom. Andrew didn't look at me when I walked into his office. He didn't offer a seat, didn't close the blinds, didn't do that thing where he softened his voice before asking for favors. He stayed behind his desk, fingers laced, and said, "There's talk, Tina. I can't control it. I didn't mean for it to come out like this, but I also can't let it escalate. This isn't about what we did, it's about how it's being perceived." I didn't ask what he meant by we. I just watched his mouth move and realized how far away I'd drifted from who I used to be, from who I thought I was when I first walked into that job. He said it would be a quiet departure. No statements, no damage control, just a clean break, a resignation they'd process without HR flags if I agreed to leave by Friday. I nodded, not because I was okay with it, but because I'd already lost more than a paycheck. I gathered my things in a plain cardboard box, the kind they use for leftover birthday cakes and broken monitors, and walked past the desks I used to stop by, the people I used to laugh with, and the hallway where I first met Andrew, where everything changed without me realizing the cost. I drove home with the radio off, not because I wanted silence, but because no song felt small enough to fill the space that had opened up inside me, a space where my name didn't echo back anymore, where the version of myself that used to hum along to late-night talk shows or grocery store jazz had gone quiet, like she knew she wasn't welcome in this version of my life. And when I pulled into the driveway, I realized how the house didn't even look different. The shutters still crooked, the porch light still flickering, but the way I walked up to it felt different. Like I wasn't returning, just passing through something that used to be mine. And when I opened the door and set down the box, the sound it made was too loud for an empty room. There was a letter on the coffee table, not in an envelope, not folded, just sitting there like it wanted to be seen before I had a chance to decide. If I wanted to read it, and the handwriting was Dave's, not rushed, not angry, just patient and sad in that way only someone who still loves you can write. He said he'd stayed in a motel for now, that he didn't want to split things up yet. Not until we talked, but he needed time. Needed to feel like he wasn't the last one to realize the house had already emptied of something more important than furniture. And in the middle of the page, right between lines about sorting bills and forwarding mail, he wrote, "You were always my anchor, Tina, the person I tied myself to when the world felt like too much. But you chose to drift, and I can't hold on to someone who cuts their own rope." I folded the paper like it would stop the ache, but it didn't. It just made it smaller and sharper. The days after felt like walking through fog with my hands out, trying to find the edges of something that didn't want to be found, because people didn't ask questions, not directly, but their eyes did. And the way they paused just a little. Too long when they passed me in the grocery store or the post office or even the pharmacy said more than words could, and I started to realize that silence could be crueler than gossip, because it left room for imagination, for every version of the truth except the one I might have been brave enough to tell. I checked my email 3 times a day out of habit, even though the account was disabled, even though there was nothing left for me there. But part of me hoped for something, a message, a word, a moment of kindness from Andrew, some acknowledgement that this wasn't all my fault, that he had played a part, that he had seen me not as a mistake, but as a person. But no message came, no text, no call. Just that familiar emptiness that started to feel like a second skin, and I hated how well it fit. Nights were the worst, not because I missed anyone specific, but because that was when everything slowed down enough to hear myself think, and what I thought about wasn't the kiss, or the moment in the rain, or even the hotel room where everything changed. It was the way I let it all happen without asking who I was turning into. Without stopping long enough to realize that being seen by someone doesn't mean you have to lose yourself in their version of you. And when I sat in the armchair that used to be Dave's favorite, the one with the worn armrest and the coffee stain on the cushion, I couldn't help but feel how cold the fabric was now, like even the furniture had moved on. I didn't tell our daughter, not right away, because what was I supposed to say? That her mother made a series of quiet choices that stacked up into a loud collapse. That love wasn't lost in a single moment, but in the slow erosion of attention and honesty, and the kind of care that doesn't need to be spoken to be real. And when she did call and ask if everything was okay, I said yes, even though my voice cracked on the second syllable, and she didn't press, just said she loved me and hung up a little faster than usual. There were days I wanted to go back to that moment under the hotel awning, to pull away before the kiss, to say something light and awkward like I always used to keep everything safe and intact. But the truth is, I didn't want safety back then. I wanted to feel alive, wanted to be chosen, noticed, anything but invisible. And now that I had all this space and silence to sit with, I started to wonder if I'd confused being wanted with being whole. I made tea that night and held the mug too tightly, like heat could somehow fill the places that had gone numb. And as I looked out the window, I didn't cry, I didn't rage, I didn't even sigh, I just sat there in the quiet, not because I liked it, but because it was mine. And for the first time in weeks, maybe months, I realized that I wasn't waiting for someone to walk through the door. I wasn't hoping for a message or an apology. I was just breathing, just existing. And even if I didn't know what came next, I knew that pretending nothing happened wouldn't undo what had been done. They didn't ask me anything when I started working at the flower shop. No paperwork questions about why I left my last job. No soft-voiced manager trying to guess whether I'd bring baggage to the register. No curious coworkers trying to pin my story to my shoes. Just a woman named Beth with gray-streaked braids who handed me an apron and said, Watch the roses, they bruise easy. And in some strange way, that was the kindest welcome I could have hoped for, because the silence meant I didn't have to lie. And not lying was the only dignity I had left. Most mornings I was there before opening, setting buckets out onto the sidewalk, wiping condensation off glass jars with the same kind of care I used to reserve for documents and calculators, and it helped. The rhythm of petals and stems, the way tulips leaned toward the light like they were still trying even after being cut, the way lavender held its scent even when everything else in the world had gone quiet around me. But the town didn't forget, and I heard it sometimes when I walked home past the deli or stood in line at the pharmacy, just the sharp hum of two people saying, "Wasn't she the one?" And I didn't need to hear the rest because I knew exactly who I was in their story now. Not a woman who slipped once and fell hard, but a symbol, a cautionary tale, a whisper someone passed like a napkin with lipstick on it. At the office, they'd scrubbed his name clean, like bleach on a mistake. No forwarded from Andrew Reynolds, no photos on the company website, just a new nameplate, new email, new rules. And I found myself checking out of habit, typing the first few letters of his name as if muscle memory could overwrite the last 6 months of my life. But the system just blinked blankly back at me, and my phone, the same one I used to check a dozen times a day, just in case he'd say something, anything, had gone still, not just from him, but from everyone. My son's last message was a thumbs up on a birthday post 2 weeks ago, and even Linda, the friend who once cried laughing with me over sangria and broken heels, had left my texts unread for 4 days straight. So I wrote, "Not for anyone but me," in a dollar store notebook with flowers on the cover. Not ironic, just convenient. Trying to trace where exactly it began to slide. Not the kiss, not the first night at the hotel, but earlier. The way he'd looked at me like I was still someone. The way I'd responded like I hadn't been seen in decades. Because if I didn't write it down, I was scared I'd start telling myself none of it happened. That I'd start believing the version where I was just tired or lonely or confused, when really I wasn't confused at all. I was wide awake. The dream came on a night like any other. No special date, no wine before bed. Just a long shift and the aching feeling behind my eyes that warned me I'd been awake too long inside my own thoughts. And in the dream, I was back at the office. Not the new one or the flower shop, but the old conference room with the windows that fogged up in the morning, and he was sitting in my chair like he belonged there more than I ever did. Calm, composed, looking at me like he always used to, not with fire or lust, but with this quiet challenge, as if he were waiting to see what I'd admit to even if no one asked. And he said, "You knew what this would do." Not as an accusation, not as a scolding, just a statement wrapped in finality. And I nodded. In the dream, I didn't even try to argue. I nodded, turned, and walked out before he could finish, because I finally understood the thing that had sat under my ribs all this time wasn't guilt, not even regret, it was recognition. The kind that lives in your spine long after your name's been erased from the doors you once had keys to. In the morning, I opened the shop alone and found a single peony someone must have forgotten in the prep bucket, half-opened, soft white, with a faint pink stain in the center, like it had held on just long enough to be noticed. And I wrapped it in paper I didn't charge for and placed it in a mason jar we usually saved for overstock stems. Set it by the window near the cash register, and just stood there watching how the light made its edges glow like paper lanterns on a lake, thinking how strange it is that something can be beautiful and dying at the same time, and that maybe that's all I had been. Not ruined, not destroyed, just in bloom past the point of rescue. The town moved on without me, which hurt more than any of the gossip ever did, because part of me had secretly hoped someone would ask how I was doing, or whether I needed anything, or even just say, "I get it." But no one ever did. Not at church, not at the store, not even the regulars at the flower shop who smiled when I handed them bouquets and never once asked my name. And the silence wasn't sharp like a knife. It was soft, like dust settling over something you'll never touch again. And it made me feel older than I was. Not in years, but in use. Like I'd been picked up, held, and put back down too many times. I stopped waiting for messages. I stopped explaining myself. even in my own head. I stopped hoping that someone, Dave, my son, Andrew, would fill in the silence with anything other than their absence. Because I realized the noise had never been theirs to begin with. It had always been mine. The rushing, aching noise of a woman trying to remember what it felt like to be needed for something other than reliability. So when I stood by the window, that Thursday afternoon, watching a mother with her daughter pick out daisies for a school recital, I didn't cry or flinch or feel small. I just took the last remaining peony, placed it in the center of the counter, and whispered, "You don't have to forgive to move forward," not because I needed to hear it, but because somewhere inside, some version of me, younger, softer, not yet burned, might have needed it more than I ever did now. And when the doorbell chimed and a regular came in for his usual 2 sunflowers and sprig of eucalyptus, I handed it to him with the same hands that once shook under a conference room table, and I smiled the kind of smile that doesn't ask for anything back, and I meant it, because sometimes grace isn't a second chance. It's a full stop, one that leaves you standing still, heart quiet, shame heavy, and still breathing.